So thank you so much for joining us today. My name's Carly Hansen and I'm one of the Sector Sustainability Coordinators at Community Legal Centres Queensland. Today's webinar is Climate Change and Legal Need. What do we know and where are the gaps? Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding today's session. In Meanjin, Brisbane, they are the Turrbal and Yagara people. I wish to pay respect to their elders, past, present and future, and acknowledge that these are stolen lands and that sovereignty was never ceded. As today's webinar is being viewed by people throughout Queensland, and we've also got a lot of interstate folk joining us today, I'd also like to pay respect to the traditional owners throughout the country and extend a very warm welcome to any First Nations people who are joining us today. So I'm really pleased to welcome Monica Taylor, PhD student at the QUT School of Law, who will be presenting today's session. She'll be sharing some initial observations from an ongoing study about changing civil law needs as a result of climate change. Monica is going to present some literature about the impacts of climate change and in particular extreme heat on priority population groups and common areas of community law. CLCs that understand the correlation between climate change and everyday legal need will hopefully after this session be better placed to respond through their casework, law reform and community legal education. So I'll hand over to Monica and let her tell you a bit more about herself and her project in just a moment. But before I do that, some quick housekeeping. So today's webinar is being recorded and we'll have the recording available for you to download later this afternoon. The PowerPoints in a PDF format have been emailed out to everyone, or the link to grab those has been emailed out to everyone who registered this morning. But if you didn't catch that email, you can also grab them from the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. So we'll have a couple of polls for you to answer in a moment. So please do pop your responses in when they appear on the screen. We'll also break midway through to ask questions or to, get your questions, but, feel free to type those in as you see them or think of them, and you can do that on the GoToWebinar control panel just in the chat box. So without further ado, I might hand over to Monica now to get us started, and then we'll run the polls. Thanks, Monica.
Thanks, Carly. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us online. And thanks also to Community Legal Centres Queensland for organising the webinar series. I also want to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples here in Meanjin, Brisbane, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And to any First Nations people joining us on the line, I acknowledge your presence and pay my respects to you for being here. I also want to acknowledge at the outset the devastating impact that climate change is having upon First Nations people's connection to country and culture, but also to note that so many of the solutions that we need to embark on to adapt to the crisis really involves us centering the expertise and wisdom held by First Nations peoples and their communities, both in their care for country, but also for each other. What I'm going to do over the next 40 minutes or so is to, from research that I'm doing into the impact of climate change on civil law needs in the Australian context. So this is really exploratory work that is still in its fairly early stages. I've been looking at the research for a couple of years, but doing that on a part-time basis as I've been working in the social service sector. But I'm really keen to engage with community legal centres on this topic. It's directly relevant to the work that you're all doing. And the other thing, of course, is that there's always a lag effect between what the research says and what is already coming in through the door of our CLCs and how clients are presenting. So it likely means that you already have a pretty good working understanding of how climate change is manifesting itself in the legal problems that people have. But that's actually a pretty good way to kick off with the polls. So that we can get a sense of the expertise in the webinar room and kind of what you might bring already by way of knowledge to the discussion.
Great, so everyone should see that poll on their screen now. So the question is, how would you rate your understanding of how climate change impacts legal need? So the options being poor, that's why I'm here in today's webinar, medium or strong. And so those responses are coming through. It looks like lots of people sitting in the medium category, but also about an equal amount in the poor category. So I'll give you another 10 seconds to pop your response in there. Okay, just another 5 seconds. All right, I'll shut that poll now and just share those results with you.
Oh, that's really terrific. So, yeah, a lot of people coming to maybe get a sense of things for the first time, and some of you with a medium understanding. And then we've got a second poll as well, which just asks whether you actually have experience advising clients in disasters. So that should be coming up too.
Wonderful, we're seeing those come through. So maybe just another 10 seconds on that one as well.
Awesome, so it looks as though about 20% of people,
there we go,
24%, yeah, have experience, and most of us don't. All right, well, that's a really good way to kick off. And what I'd like to sort of stress at the outset is that if you've come here for any kind of concrete answers about climate change and legal need, then I'm afraid I can't offer those up for you at all. But hopefully there's some useful information that you can take back to your workplaces to add to your understanding of how legal need may be changing as our climate changes. So this is how I'm going to structure the webinar this afternoon. First, I'll provide an overview of the current state of play in terms of literature and evidence about where we're likely to see, or in fact where we are already seeing, legal need presenting due to climate change. So this will touch on common areas of community law practice, but also talk about certain CLC priority client groups. I'll talk a little bit about the distinction between legal problems generated by extreme weather events, as opposed to the more hidden legal issues that arise outside the so-called disaster cycle. We'll spend a bit of time looking at extreme heat and how this is likely to be a factor in generating civil law need, followed by some discussion about the role of geography in estimating climate-induced legal need. And towards the end of the session, we won't have much time, but I just want to do a little bit of framing around the concept of climate justice and what this means, and how it might be viewed as a new justice frontier for community legal centres and community lawyering. We won't have much time, as I said, but I also just want to say at the outset that the Federation of Community Legal Centres in Victoria is doing some terrific work on climate justice legal needs. And so there may be learnings from that project that we can all benefit from down the track. So that's just a bit of an interstate watch this space. Also just to say that this isn't a webinar about climate mitigation through legal work to prevent coal, gas or mining projects. In the climate world, there's really two spheres of policy and work sitting in mitigation and adaptation. And there is some really important, creative, groundbreaking legal work that I'm sure everyone's aware of, that the EDO and the EJA and some private law firms are bringing to mitigate emissions. So that work is absolutely vital. As they say, every fraction of a degree of warming matters, but for today's purposes, the focus of the discussion is really community lawyering and legal need in the adaptation space. And the other thing I just want to put out there, none of the information in the slides is good news. So it can be quite difficult to push through the evidence on climate change. So we'll try and do that gently. It does help to have a sense of collective solidarity and a feeling that you've got some agency in the information that's presented to you. We don't have the luxury of denial anymore. There is absolutely hope with our new government that fast and fair action on climate change will be realised, but there's no escaping the fact that climate change is an accelerant for social disadvantage. And the challenge for the sector is to quickly and strategically build our climate consciousness and our professional skills so that we can assist those who stand to lose the most from the climate crisis. All right, so let's just do a little bit of a recap in terms of how we understand the concept of legal need. We all know, I think, at the macro level that legal need surveys are the primary tool for generating a representative picture of legal need. They can give that national and regional snapshot, and based on the evidence that we have from these large-scale surveys, as well as the studies into access to justice that have happened for decades, but the ones that are most recent appear there on your slide, we know really conclusively that Australia's most disadvantaged people experience multiple and intersecting legal problems that often go unaddressed, and that results in adverse outcomes. And so there's not one simple, robust measure or indicator that we can use to identify and estimate the level of legal need, but these surveys do give us a really solid foundation. What they don't do though, and what they haven't done at all, is think about climate in the context of driving legal need. So none of those surveys have considered climate change, and they haven't used climate indicators in any of their assessments. The other thing that large-scale studies overlook are those deeper insights that we can glean from more smaller qualitative pieces of work, and also the many contextual factors that can be present depending on the client group and the area of law. So at the moment in Australia, we don't have anything at a macro level, but nor do we have qualitative studies that have explored the intersection between climate change and legal need. But if we were to draw a Venn diagram of the intersections, it would probably look something a little bit like this. On the one hand, we have our priority population groups. So that's a diverse, disadvantaged, often hard to reach group of people with legal problems that cluster together and that can compound. And overlaying that is the reality of climate change and the impacts that flow from it. So you can see there floods, bushfires, storms, extreme heat, air pollution, reduced water quality, drought, food insecurity, environmental depletion, allergens. What's not listed is the loss of biodiversity that we're experiencing and witnessing. So the great extinction process that is on at the moment in terms of habitat and biodiversity loss, insects and so forth. But depending on who your clients are and where they live, they'll likely have legal problems impacted by climate change in different ways. So making some coherent sense of this in a way that helps us to have a framework to spot the legal issues, when they're likely to arise and how best to service them is what I'm hoping that this program of research is going to support. So also just in terms of a recap, let's remind ourselves about what we've been responding to. This is a rough sketch of the many climate-induced events that have taken place, and it really only stretches back a decade or so. You can see that in amongst it all, we've experienced COVID as well. And the arrival of the pandemic so soon after the devastating bushfires in 2019 and 2020 meant that I don't think we really had the time and the space to process the full impact of those bushfires. I mean, the Royal Commission did a really terrific job in reporting on the response. But I think the other thing that the COVID pandemic has done is it's forced us to respond to another disaster in an imperfect situation. So the timeframes between disasters is contracting, and that's absolutely what the science clearly says to us. We can expect that the frequency of extreme weather events is going to increase, and their intensity is going to increase as well. Australia is one of the most vulnerable developed countries to climate impacts. Our land surface temperatures have risen close to 1.5 degrees. I think it's 1.47 degrees since 1910. And so with that comes extreme weather events. The southern part of Australia is getting drier, and northern Australia is becoming wetter. And the moisture content in the air for floods and extreme rainfall is increasing. But what do we know? We are starting to get, I think, some really solid anecdotal understanding of the implications of climate change on legal needs for people that CLCs service, and particularly the obvious area, I think, where it's being seen and addressed is in the context of extreme weather events. So many of you are providing important assistance across areas of law that get really sharpened and come into view post-disaster. So areas of insurance law, consumer protection, tenancy, employment, domestic violence, social security law issues, supporting people to access benefits and disaster payments that governments might have available, help finding ID and documentation that might have been burnt or destroyed in a flood, for example. So there is that sort of working understanding that these are the areas of law that commonly arise in the aftermath of a disaster. That is supported with international evidence. So there's quite a lot of information post-Katrina in the USA, the Christchurch earthquake and the tsunami in Japan. A lot of those issues can be similar fact. So there can be an influx of similar fact matters in a particular area of law. And another common thing that's certainly coming out of the US research is that disasters and subsequent disaster relief efforts can entrench social inequities and polarize wealth trajectories along established lines of inequality. So we are, I think, gleaning, and this is based on the great work of the disaster legal help lawyers, the bushfire lawyers in Victoria, also the flood work, a lot of the work that Townsville and Flood Legal Help has been doing here in Queensland. About responding to disasters in ways that are human rights informed and human rights respecting. But civil law issues outside the disaster cycle is where things really drop off in terms of what we know. We know very little about the intersection of legal issues and slow onset climate change. We don't have any kind of framework to understand what the hidden legal need is, when it's likely to arise, and how we might be able to service it. Extreme heat is likely, I think, to be an important contributing factor across many areas of civil law, and we'll talk about that in a little moment. But an important thing, I think, to mention is that our clients are structurally vulnerable to climate impacts because of poverty, racism, ableism, so all those isms that give rise to entrenched disadvantage and that our society is designed and our systems perpetuate. And so a climate justice response is broader than just a disaster response, and that is taking a bigger systemic look through the work that we do to address those underlying social, economic and political drivers that make people susceptible to the impacts of climate change. And there's a scholar who's talks about the fact that vulnerability doesn't fall from the sky. It's socially constructed and produced. So in the absence of available evidence in the legal literature, it's good, I think, for us to know what the climate impacts are on the priority groups that we typically see. And we can kind of glean from that some of the areas of law that are downstream relevant from those impacts. We can look at the people we typically support and what that research says, but obviously we need to be mindful of intersectionality. People don't fit into those neat boxes. There's inevitably overlap with the multiple identities and legal issues that people have. But I still think the research is useful, particularly as we're starting to kind of build that picture in this exploratory stage. Another theme that really comes through in that literature is caution about using language in a deficit way and labelling certain people really vulnerable to climate change. And that couldn't be truer than for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons. It's really strongly present in the research, and I think important to be reminded that Indigenous peoples have very high adaptive capacity and resilience to the impacts of climate, and a strengths-based approach rather than discourses that position Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as being vulnerable to climate change is really important in this work. That's not to say, of course, that First Nations peoples aren't impacted. Of course, they are, and there's litigation, at the international stage that demonstrates that. But the exposure to climate impacts is compounded in many ways by pre-existing disadvantage, by poor health, housing and education. All of those issues, of course, are linked to and a legacy of colonialism. First Nations peoples hold cultural knowledge of land management practices and very high levels of agency through their diverse approaches to climate adaptation. And so adaptation efforts need to be grounded in the right to self-determination, and Indigenous peoples and communities are given control over their lives and their activities. I'll speak very quickly now just to some other interest groups, and that'll follow with another couple of slides. People, if you're working with people experiencing homelessness, particularly rough sleepers, there's research to suggest that people experiencing homelessness are highly vulnerable to weather, and you can imagine why, in ways that anyone living in secure housing is not. There was a fairly recent Australian empirical study in 2019 that found that extreme weather events were a pathway for 16% of people experiencing homelessness. So that's direct impacts from extreme weather, but extreme weather events also generate significant indirect impacts on mental health, rupturing of social connections, and long-term trauma. And the impact of hot temperatures on heat-sensitive medication was also documented in that study, and that can also further contribute to a deterioration in physical and mental health. So if you're working with people who are rough sleepers, who have poor mental health, and who might be on treatment authorities or in the mental health system, knowing and being aware of the fact that high temperature days might compromise the effectiveness of medication if there's a situation where that medication is being carried on the person, I suppose. Women and children, we've got really solid research now, I think, about the correlation between domestic violence and disasters. There was an empirical study after the Black Saturday bushfires that established evidence of increase of violence against women in the aftermath of that particular event. And there's also evidence of increased violence against women in relation to declining water availability in the context of regional droughts. So not just typical disasters, but droughts being a good example of slow onset. They kind of, it happens by stealth. There hasn't been much research at all connecting people with disability and their carers with climate change. However, there's been a really terrific piece of work done recently here in Queensland. It was a large multi-sectoral project with multiple collaborators driven by the University of Sydney, and Michelle Villeneuve is the lead on that. That project generated new insights into how and why people with disability in Australia are disproportionately impacted by disasters, and how person-centred frameworks can be used to advance disability-inclusive disaster risk reduction. So if you're working with people with disabilities in that space, I think that is a really useful piece of work that's available there on the slide, and I'd encourage you to go and check that one out. That international evidence also speaks to the challenges in recovery for people with disability that require more support. And those barriers to recovery include housing, transportation, employment, physical and mental health, and obviously accessing recovery services. Children and young people, the work we're seeing largely is in the climate mitigation space, and the exciting test case that the EDO is leading with its client Youth Verdict. But putting that climate litigation work to one side, I think if you're working with children and young people, it's important just to be reminded of the psychosocial evidence of children in the context of climate change. So late last year, there was a landmark global survey that was released and published in the Lancet on climate anxiety in young people. So it was more than 10,000 young people surveyed across 10 countries, and Australia was one of those countries. And you can see some of the sobering findings that the survey reveals. So more than half of those young people feel that humanity is doomed. More than about 3/4, the future is frightening. People have failed to care for the planet. Half of young people feel that their family security will be threatened, and more than 1/3 are hesitant to have children. And there is more research coming out about young people making decisions, bodily autonomy decisions, to have early sterilisation on the basis that they do not want to have children. So if there are people working with children and young people, that might be just useful information to have in the broader context of the work that you're doing. All right, the next couple of slides are on extreme heat. I think it's likely to be an important contributing factor that's going to cut across many areas of civil legal need, and many of you might be seeing this already. So I'd really encourage you, we're going to break for a little moment and pause for questions or comments in the chat. So love to know what people think about extreme heat and its how it might be presenting. So climate change is driving longer, hotter, more intense heat waves. They're often referred to as a silent killer. They cause more deaths than any other extreme weather event, including bushfires, floods, and cyclones. In Australia here, extreme heat is responsible for over 1,100 annual deaths. And so that's greater than the annual road toll. The working definition of heat waves is 3 or more days in a row of unusually high temperatures relative to the local long-term climate in the recent past. Here in Queensland, Southeast Queensland is a recognised climate change hotspot, and that's because of our coastal location, our subtropical climate, and the fact that we're one of the fastest growing regions in Australia. And Brisbane is especially vulnerable because of its high humidity. So humidity is a really key correlative factor to heat stress and mortality. But not just Brisbane, urban areas are particularly heat vulnerable due to the heat island effect. So the radiant heat that can come off cement and the built environment, and the lack of green space to have a cooling effect. But also, cities have high concentrations of vulnerable people, so that's also why urban areas are particularly heat vulnerable. In terms of what we know, obviously many CLC clients are impacted by So I'm just reading, yes, oh yes, and there's a comment that's coming through the chat. It's very hard to concentrate on legal work when it is very hot. Yeah, I agree, absolutely. There's a whole other session we could probably do about our own workplace health and safety. Yeah, obviously clients that are really particularly susceptible to the impacts of extreme heat are children, the elderly, people with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness, some of that I've talked about already. Poor folk who are living with energy poverty, who can't fund the air conditioning or the cooling devices needed to make their homes more comfortable, or have poorly ventilated properties. And that can be certainly the impact for a lot of people living in social housing, particularly the older builds. There's also evidence that extreme heat can be weaponised against vulnerable people. So prisoners and domestic and family violence victim survivors fall into that category. There is some commentary, and you can see some media snips there about the weaponisation of extreme heat from the Dondale Youth Detention Facility. There were reports about the lack of any air conditioning or airflow in that closed environment, and that can often be used as a tool of punishment, a form of punishment. More research in the United States documenting the role of heat in prisons, and a recognition that that heat exposure in incarceration settings is an overlooked injustice. You can see those media reports of high heat across employment law, tenancy law, admin law as well. The danger of working in extreme heat is underscored, so in an employment context, is underscored by some coroner's court decisions, and there are some links there, and Caxton Legal Centre, I know, provided assistance in one of those coronial investigations. So that's a summary of what's sort of available in terms of extreme heat at the moment. I'm sure people have working examples of ways that they might be seeing extreme heat impact on clients' legal problems. So we might just pause here for a minute, and I'll stop talking and have a sip of water. But if there are comments or thoughts people have, love to know what you're thinking, and please pop them in the chat.
Okay, so starting to get some comments coming through, which is great. So thank you, Steph, who said it's really interesting to see the details about the vulnerabilities of Brisbane and Southeast Queensland in particular. So having lived here for 30+ years, it's certainly getting more challenging. And in their home of 20 years, they've added fans 5 years ago and aircon last year just to be able to keep living there. That's absolutely right.
And so great, Stephanie, that you've been able to have the resources to do that in your own home. Yeah, we're all feeling it for sure. All right, I might move on to the next slide, and thank you for those of you. Feel free to keep popping chat comments in the chat as we go through. But the next thing I just thought would be good to mention is the role of geography in considering climate change impact legal need. And there are already some good tools to help identify legal needs that do use geography and geographic indicators. The Law and Justice Foundation's National Legal Needs Dashboard is one example. What I have on the slide are some excerpts from a recent report that the Climate Council released on Australia's most climate vulnerable places. So this is really recent research, and it's also a very accessible report. So it's a handy one if you are thinking about your place and space in terms of geography. I think it's useful information, not because it deals with home ownership and insurability of properties, but it indicates where those areas are that are particularly climate vulnerable. And for Queenslanders on the line, the data really points to Queensland regions being overrepresented. So you can see the top 10 most at-risk federal electorates. 5 of those are in Queensland, but when you look at the top 20 that are contained in the report, there are another 6 locations that are Queensland based. So Maranoa is climate vulnerable. That takes in the towns of Charleville, Cunnamulla, Dalby, Roma, Kingaroy, St George, Stanthorpe, Winton and Warwick. The electorate of Moncrieff is part of the Gold Coast, so that includes Surfers Paradise, Broadbeach Waters and Mermaid Waters. Right is the Gold Coast hinterland area, so that takes in the towns of Beaudesert, Jimboomba, Boona, Laidley, Hatton and Helidon. The Brisbane seats are represented as well, but interestingly, in the top 20, we also have Wide Bay, the seat of Ford, Ryan and Moreton, and the seat of Blair and Fairfax. So that takes in the Fraser Coast, Noosa Shire, some parts of Gympie, parts of Logan and the Gold Coast, part of the Sunshine Coast, and some of those outer reaches of Brisbane City, including Ipswich and Somerset. The other thing that is, I think, worth looking at is having a play around with the climate risk map that the Climate Council has produced. So that's an interactive map, and it's broken down into postcode, suburb, local government area, federal electorate, and you can switch between low, medium and high emission scenarios and different timeframes. So what a 2030 high emission scenario might look like, 2050, 2100. You can also change the hazard profile. So you can look at riverine flooding, bushfire, surface water flooding, coastal inundation, extreme wind, and it's a national map. So wherever you are in the country, it's that resource that's available. So I think that if you are a geographic centre delivering place-based, really doing that kind of place-based work, then familiarising yourself with the geographic indicators is a really useful thing, and thinking about what that then means for your clients. All right, so just to sort of summarise, we are getting an understanding through the work that people are doing about the civil legal need that is correlated with disasters, so the direct legal need that flows from disasters. Also building our understanding in the full disaster cycle, so preparation, prevention, as well as recovery and response. And that is backed up by the limited evidence that's coming through from you all and from the Royal Commission. And so we're getting that picture together. But there are really big gaps in our understanding about civil law needs outside the disaster cycle. And I think that's something connected to climate justice and climate vulnerability that we really need to be mindful of. The role of extreme heat, I suspect, is going to continue to be really significant, but we don't have any solid research on that yet. So that's something to focus on, and for us all to build our climate literacy for our specific communities of interest. So whether we're working with women, with people experiencing homelessness, for prisoners, people with disability, being aware of what the social science and the human geography research, psychosocial research is saying about our communities of interest will help us be more climate conscious in the work that we do. So all of that's really been a kind of a what. This final slide is a where to and a how, and some other things that we might like to think about. So I'd invite people to think about what a climate justice response looks like for your clients. Does that mean that the legal work that we do may need to shift to the extent that we can in the funding environment that we have to being a little bit more preventative and less reactive? Does it mean that we need to sort of think about that relative mix of casework versus law reform and CLE, and maybe driving the skill set needs of lawyers to be able to better identify and address legal need in that way. And there is a need to avoid climate adaptation privilege. So I think we do have a responsibility to ensure that our clients aren't going to get done over by adaptation plans that just do not reflect their lived experience, do not have their voice, they haven't had a seat at the table in the design of any climate adaptation strategies. There's an opportunity to build climate consciousness by looking at the terrific work that Justice Brian Preston has done. So there are articles, speeches, more information now about what it means to be a climate conscious lawyer. You can subscribe to Climate Council updates. That's a really easy thing. They've got such amazing resources and they strike that balance by being, I think, information heavy but not too sort of dense and demystify, kind of difficult to read. It's very different, for example, to the IPCC work that comes out. Also, the CLCQ webinar archives are a fantastic hive of information, and the Flood series has got really a rich source of info for us all. And I think the ABC Law Report is also a really good listen, and there are drawing a lot on the work of the New South Wales recoveries, interviews with lawyers, and that is also really informative. And considering the local adaptation efforts and alliances, what alliances can we build that can be place-based but also outside the community legal sector? Maybe alliances with local government, and how might we think about using the Human Rights Act as a vehicle to advocate not in individual cases but also for climate adaptation responses that are non-discriminatory, fair and just. Thank you so much everyone for your time. That brings us to the end of the session, so it's time for Q&A if anyone has got questions.
Thank you, Monica. That's fabulous. I mean, fabulous presentation, but very scary in terms of the things that are happening, particularly in Southeast Queensland. So I'll invite everyone to ask your questions. Just pop those into the chat. And while they are coming through, there has been just a comment here around some the government in New South Wales sort of encouraging people to move out of flood-prone areas if they could afford that. And I guess just posing that question, or a scenario where there might be flow-on effects of ghettoisation of poor people in disaster-prone areas, and how terrible that would be if that was the outcome. So Ashley's also asked a question here. So Monica, will you be continuing your research in terms of what practical changes need to be made in our laws in Australia to address these issues?
Thanks, Ashley. Yes, I hope so. At the moment, I'm focusing on trying to really do that exploratory work to join the dots between the impacts of climate change on the vulnerable priority population groups, and actually the community legal sector's adaptive capacity, the way that we can best respond to that emerging legal need. I'm actually at the stage where we're about to do some empirical, the empirical part of the research. So I'm very keen to, I'd invite anyone who's working at a community legal centre or in the legal assistance sector who wants to participate or be involved to register their interest in this research, to register their interest. So you can do that by shooting me an email or connecting with Carly, I suppose, but my email's there on the screen. And yeah, I mean, I think that the areas of law, it's really vast, and people who are working in the front line are best able, I think, to identify when those changes need to be made, and it can be very procedural and incremental stuff, as well as really bold new legislative approaches.
Ashley's just expanded on that comment there, just looking at some Holly Higgins' work as well on ecocide.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. I am familiar with that work. Actually, that's a little bit out of scope for what I'm looking at the moment. Yeah, it's important work, and there are many very clever people pursuing it.
So for CLCs, Monica, would you suggest that it's a good idea for them to try and collect some data? I know that's not about unmet need, but you know, when we're looking at met need, I suppose, or some of the things that are coming through the door in CLC land, often clients won't necessarily identify that it's flood related. So particularly if they, you know, coming for support around a domestic violence matter, for example. Is there a way that some of that data can help with, you know, identifying who's being impacted and where to next?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, if there's a standardized way that can happen, I think that is so useful, because if we don't collect the data, we can't really build that service picture, the administrative kind of picture of what we're seeing, and we can't measure it, and we can't do all the other things that we do with, you know, the data that we collect.
Great. So a few more minutes to pop any last burning questions you've got into the chat while we've got our expert in the room. But Monica, were there any other comments or things you wanted to share with the group before we finish up today?
No, I mean, I think keep an eye out for the Victorians on the call, the terrific work that the Federation is doing, which is in its early stages, the Climate Justice Legal Needs Project, and taking my QUT hat off momentarily and putting another hat on. Lawyers for Climate Justice Australia is a nascent group of lawyers that are striving to achieve climate justice outcomes for people. So you can always keep an eye out on what Lawyers for Climate Justice are doing as well by following their socials too.
Wonderful. We can put that link into the materials when we send out the recordings for today's webinar. So that's all the questions that have come through, Mon. So I think maybe we might wrap up today's session, and I'm sure, I mean, hopefully in the future, once the research is more progressed, we can have you back and see what some of those outcomes from your PhD have been. But for now, thank you so much for coming in today and sharing what you've done so far, and yes, getting some comments coming through just saying it was a really thought-provoking, excellent presentation. So I'm sure everyone feels that way who's on the call. So thank you so much, and thanks everyone for your questions and comments as well. So as I mentioned, we'll have the recording from today's session available for you this afternoon, so I'll email that one out. And we will hopefully see you at the next CLCQ webinar in a couple of weeks. And don't forget to please pop your feedback into the survey once the webinar has closed off. So thanks again, Monica, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Carly.
Stay cool or warm, depending on wherever you are. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.